Hello, I'm Iain Gray and I'm the Learning Design Lead at Me Learning, and I'm here with Professor Thomas Ormerod. Hello, Tom.
Hi, Iain.
And we're here to discuss all manner of things around learning theory, including the study that we carried out with your undergraduate students. So let's start off by, if you could introduce yourself and what your faculty does at the University of Sussex.
Thank you, yes. So I'm Tom Ormerod. I'm a professor of cognitive psychology at the University of Sussex. I was head of the School of Psychology for a while, but now I just focus more on research and teaching. And I have a particular role in the School of Psychology to do with knowledge exchange, which is taking the products of our psychological research and getting them into business and into organisations. So providing psychology as a service, which is how we came to start building our relationship together.
Mm-hmm. And the benefits, I suppose, to the university of getting more involved in the private sector?
I guess there are three benefits that come to mind. One, which is, I think, important to my paymasters, is they see it as a way to earn some money.
Cold hard cash.
And that always helps. The things that interest me about the relationship, most of all, are firstly, that it gives me a way to demonstrate or discover the impact of my research. And if I want to persuade funders to invest in my research, such as the government, I have to be able to show that it's useful.
So in the real world,
as
opposed
world,
to within an academic.
Yeah, so it's got to help people, it's got to cure people, it's got to make us more money, it's got to solve problems, that kind of stuff, and not just be about an academic ivory tower. And the second thing that's important to me is that I can go out and test my theories with people who aren't just undergraduate psychology students. If it's an unfortunate truth that 90% plus of all psychological research is done on psychology undergraduate students. And whilst they represent many of the qualities of normal human beings, they are nonetheless a specialist group. And it's important for us to have theories that generalize to the general public. And one of the beauties of the work that we've done together is it's targeting real users of your products.
Mm-hmm. It is, I suppose, regulation and my knowledge around psychology and psychological history and study is very limited. But is regulation one of the reasons why it's harder to get a wider range of subjects? For example, looking back at I'm going to throw some names out now. Zimbardo and Zarjonk got away with murder with some of their experiments.
Yes,
not quite murder, but
no, they
virtual murder,
simulated murder,
yes.
Shall we say? Yeah, certainly things have changed in terms of the expectations of what is ethical in research. And to some extent, that does limit the sorts of work that one might do with the general public, but actually it would limit the sort of work you can do with undergraduate psychologists, because it turns out they're human beings as well.
God damn it.
So it's... but yes, I think we have upped our game ethically and morally and across science, but particularly in the behavioural sciences. But I wouldn't say that is the real limitation on getting out there and getting dirty with real people. I think it's much more to do with cost and time and relationship building, particularly. You know, if I turn up at a company and say, I'd like to take 50 of your employees for 2 days and run them through some experiments and you'll be better at the end of it. To get to that point where a company is prepared to sacrifice that amount of person power, I've got to spend a long time building relationships. And until relatively recently, a university academic would be rewarded for the teaching they do and the research they publish. And this phrase, knowledge exchange, which is relatively new, has only really recently come to prominence, this idea that actually it's worth committing a proportion of my time as an academic to building those relationships with non-academic organisations and working with them rather than just going to them and say, hey, look what I found.
You've worked with a number, I know, during our discussions. I don't know if there's any you can talk about in a public forum.
I can tell you by area, if you like.
Yes.
So I've done a lot of work with the aviation industry, mostly in a security screening context. I've worked with designers. looking at, for example, how shifts in design technology change the design process. Done a lot of work with the police and the security services on investigations and how the technologies they use change the way they investigate and test evidence. So quite a wide range. I've also worked with poets and artists and architects and anyone who'll have me, really. I'm in a sense, my main area is studying expert decision making and watching how experts make complex decisions, particularly in creative and complex domains. As people like to tell me, I basically get paid for watching other people work.
Well, that's not a bad way to make a living.
Indeed.
So I'll quickly sort of talk about the study that we carried out together. It was with 3 final year undergraduate students.
That's right.
And
can I name check them?
You can, yeah, absolutely.
Yep. So we had Beth Romero, Abby Jones, and Ella Jones.
Yes. And they were pretty fabulous.
They were wonderful.
And they all passed with flying colours.
Oh, firsts across the board, I think.
Excellent. So our study, can you give us a quick overview of sort of what we were trying to find out?
Okay. So we arrived at Me Learning, and we're very grateful for the opportunity to work with you.
Likewise.
At a time when you were just making a transition from a relatively static information presentation to a much more active approach. And that was very timely for doing a number of things. Firstly, we wanted to do a kind of sense check on whether it was working, whether you were getting the outcomes you wanted. But we noticed in talking to you that you were essentially working with 2 kinds of material, stuff that people have to learn, what we would call declarative information, where it's lots of information about, for example, regulations, that kind of stuff, but also procedural material, how to do things, the procedure being the key word there. And I suppose what we wanted to be able to see was, were the methods you were using appropriate for both kinds of work? Were they optimized for both kinds of learning? And what kind of levels of outcome were you getting?
As a sort of quick overview, we work a lot with local authorities, especially in social and healthcare. And we work with systems that people need to be trained in. And to be trained in a system, you need to know, right, if you want to do this, you go here, 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 and here. So that's very much our procedural side of things. From the declarative side, we also work in compliance and general day-to-day training. So awareness courses ranging from health and safety to disability awareness, and having an understanding of the theory behind that, or understanding of the knowledge or the laws, is very important. So yeah, you're absolutely right. We have these 2 kind of conflicting areas trying to impart that knowledge, and we have slightly different systems to teach both.
So it's one of the starting points for the study was understanding our current level of knowledge about how these different types of memory are stored. So typically, theories suggest that declarative knowledge about the world, about things, if you like, is stored in a semantic network. And what that means is you've basically got a network of all the ideas, words, concepts stored in the mind. And when you want to retrieve it, you start with one bit of information and it spreads activation across that network.
Is that like sort of keywords?
Yes. So if you imagine if you are, for example, Googling a word and then Google will go off and search the World Wide Web, which is a network of nodes of concepts and information, you can think of declarative memory as being similar to that, analogous to that at any rate. Procedural knowledge, it's assumed, is stored in a slightly different way, in a much more, if you like, rule-based way, that if a certain set of conditions arise, it triggers a rule that you've stored in your mind to do a particular action. So almost like you've got recipes stored in the mind. And those two differences, this idea of a network which spreads activation versus a series of rules that get triggered if conditions are met, lead to slightly different predictions about what would be the most effective way to learn each kind of material.
Right. And we looked at a number of parameters. So we have declarative learning, and we have declarative information, and procedural information. And then we looked at it within two other states, as in chunk size and in passive versus active.
That's right. So the first of those is what's the bite size of learning, and there's a generally accepted idea that you give people smaller chunks that build up into a whole. That'll be more effective. So this idea of rather than learning 10 pieces of information or 9 pieces of information, you learn it in 3 chunks of 3 and then put them together.
And there have been studies that have shown that's effective.
Well, this is where it gets interesting, because when the team started looking at the literature, we found while the majority of studies seem to suggest that chunk size, keeping chunk size small and building them up is a good thing, in some contexts, it not only doesn't have an effect, but can actually have the opposite effect. Right. For example, if you've got a complex procedure and you break it into chunks, when you reassemble it, it can be very confusing or an extra task to actually work out how the chunks go together. You also lose the advantage of a thing called an advance organizer. An advance organizer is, if you like, an overview of what you're going to learn. And if you break things into chunks in an insensitive way, you can lose that advance organizer.
Is that like preemptive learning almost?
Yeah, it's kind of giving you a framework, a framework to hang your learning on, if you like. So that's one side of it, chunk size. We wanted to see whether chunk size would work equally and positively for both declarative information and for procedural information. We also were interested in active learning. The idea is that rather than just passively reading stuff and trying to memorize it, you do an active task with it. You have to find things, you have to put things together, you have to carry out things. And the idea of active learning is that it elaborates the way you've encoded the information. Mm-hmm. There's lots of work that shows that the more work you do to material you're trying to learn, the much more likely you are to recover it. So, for example, if you're trying to learn a phone number, nobody needs to learn phone numbers anymore. You just look at them on our mobiles. But let's say you were trying to remember a phone number.
I can still remember the phone numbers of my best friend when I was 7 or 8.
Sure.
I didn't have a mobile phone then, so you had to learn them.
Absolutely. And that's probably what you did at age 7 or 8 was you elaborated your learning by writing it down, by forming it into little chunks, so you learn the code separate from the other bit, by maybe even making up rhymes to help yourself remember it.
It has a certain rhythm to it.
Yes, or looking at the rhythm. Basically elaborating the information. Now, active learning is essentially about elaborating your encoding of the information. It's putting extra cues into your mind that will help you retrieve it at a later date. So things like, for example, when my students are asking me how to revise for their exams, I say, well, don't just read the material. Don't just go with a highlighter pen and highlight it, although that's slightly better than just reading it. Don't just write down notes of it, although that's better than highlighting it. Change it. So write an essay plan based on it. And that way you elaborate the information much more richly, and you're far more likely to be able to recall it at a later time. So the concept of active learning then is to basically enrich your memory trace by getting people to elaborate as they learn.
Right.
And again, we wanted to find out whether this actually delivers. Because again, when we looked at the research, again, most of the research says, yeah, that's a good idea. But there's some that says, well, it depends on the person, it depends on the context of learning, it depends on the type of material of learning, and sometimes it doesn't work at all. Sometimes passive is better. So in the context, particularly of online learning in organizations such as the ones you mentioned before, it's important for us to understand whether these major mechanisms of chunk size and active learning are really delivering what you needed. At the same time, it gives us a new way of testing out psychological theory about human memory.
Right.
So I get a payoff as well as you.
It's a win-win.
It is a win-win.
Our study wasn't huge, let's say, when we actually did it, but it had a significant number of people, and we talked earlier about the sort of demographic of people who were the participants in the study.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the statistical weight, I guess, or the evidential weight of the study, if it's reasonable, and also the people who took part in it?
Sure. So one of the other problems with a lot of psychological research on memory, as well as just using undergraduate psychologists, is it previously didn't use very many of them. As a consequence, more recently, we have methods for calculating the power of an experiment. If you're expecting a particular effect size, how many participants you will need to sample. So we actually had 150, which meant that it was a properly powered study. And we used various statistical software packages to calculate that prior to going in to collect it. The other good thing about our sample was that they were real people. That is to say, they were aged, I think they ranged from 18 to 72. We had roughly equal numbers. I think we had slightly more males than females, actually.
I think it was 48 to 52 or something.
Something like that.
Something
98
like
to 52, yeah. And interestingly enough, having more males than females is usually the opposite way around in psychological research, because so many more undergraduates study psychology who are female. So it's kind of nice to shift it around a little bit. But I think the main point about it was that it was a truly representative sample of adults in the UK anyway.
As opposed to the usual undergraduate psychology students.
Yeah. So we wanted to sample your users, basically, people who would actually encounter me learning software and have to learn from it.
Excellent. So going to the study itself, what did we find out?
Well, let me tell you a little bit about what we did first.
Okay.
So we had 4 different groups of participants, and some participants learnt with big chunks, other participants learnt with small chunks. Those groups were subdivided again so that some of them learnt with an active learning style, some of them learnt with a passive learning style. And each person did 2 sets of tasks, one involving learning declarative information, the other involving learning procedural information. And it was about the sorts of things you were describing, sort of local council procedures, local council regulations, that kind of material.
I remember we had a lot of discussions about making sure that it was content that wasn't completely and utterly alien to anyone taking tests, but also something that they wouldn't have had a great amount of general knowledge about anyway, so therefore would have had an advantage beforehand.
And also stuff that wasn't too triggering or
we were very careful. That's the ethics side of things as well.
It's also the memory side of things, because we had to keep some control over the distinctiveness of the material. So if it was kind of shocking or extraordinary stuff, then we would get a very skewed set of results.
I'm sure one of them was tax. Something about tax.
Tax is always shocking, but in a different context.
Yeah. It was quite dry.
Yeah. So one group. So some of our groups got small chunks, some of them got big chunks, some of them got passive learning, some of them got active learning, and it was what we call a 2x2 design, so that you got active small chunk, active big chunk, passive small chunk, passive big chunk, either for procedural learning or declarative learning. And the task took around about 10 minutes learning, followed by multiple choice testing. And we also included an extra thing, which was a personality questionnaire, particularly focusing on cognitive styles. So there are this idea that people learn in different ways optimally. So some people are, if you like, holistic. They like to see the whole thing and get a sense of how the whole thing fits together. Some people are more analytic. They like to piece things together bit by bit and build their own connections. And there are other kind of aspects to that. And one of the things we'd seen in the literature was that sometimes the effectiveness of active learning and of chunk size are a function of what kind of person you are. So we wanted to see how that played out. So we gave people a cognitive styles questionnaire as well. So to cut to the chase, what did we actually find? Well, we were surprised.
Okay.
The good news is that overall levels of learning were pretty high, so between 60 and 80% of solution rates. And in a context where people are not being incentivized to learn particularly, they were paid to turn up, but they weren't paid to do well, then in that context, that's a pretty good rate. And I think it's consistent with the sort of levels of learning you'd expect in these kinds of contexts. So that's the good news. And in fact, it's all good news, really. So when we came to look at the results with declarative information, we found a strong effect of chunk size. That is, learning declarative information in smaller chunks gave roughly a 10% benefit compared with learning it in a large chunk.
Which is significant.
Yeah, I mean, that's the difference between a product that works and a product that doesn't work quite so well. Interestingly enough, though, active learning didn't have any significant effect at all. And in fact, the trend in the graph is, if anything, slightly the other way around. That is, that passive learning was slightly higher than active learning, independent of chunk size. And thinking about this kind of makes sense, because if you are learning a set of information that you're not going to do something with, but somebody makes you do something with it, you're kind of learning it in a slightly strange way. Whereas if you're just passively taking it in, if you've got the bite size right, you're going to optimize what you learn. If we switch then to the procedural information, the opposite happened. So on the one hand, we found that chunk size didn't make a difference. It didn't make it worse, but it didn't make it better. But what did make things, again, about 10% better was switching to an active learning rather than a passive learning style. And that makes intuitive sense to me, because with a procedure, you're going to be doing things. So active learning is doing stuff, and therefore it's consistent with the nature of the information that you're learning. And so it's a bit like, I suppose, to put it crudely, if you're trying to learn how to ride a bike, you could tell someone how to ride a bike, but ultimately they've got to do it.
Yep.
So it kind of makes obvious intuitive sense that way. But I thought at the start of the experiment, I expected that both forms of learning would affect positively both types of information. So it was. I think
we both did.
Yeah, we were. I think a little surprised that it was limited in that way. And it's important because, of course, if you pile loads of, for example, active learning into your declarative training, you're at best wasting their time and wasting your time as well. Similarly, if you break procedures down into lots of little chunks, you're at best not enhancing their learning, and you may just be annoying or confusing people. So those, I think, are two really important takeaway messages. I mean, there are lots of limitations on what we did that mean that I'm a typical academic and that my conclusion is always more research is needed. But the basic idea is that it's not just that you have to know the ways that you teach people, you've got to also know how the ways you teach people interact with the nature of the stuff they're trying to learn. And that one size in terms of learning and retrieval does definitely not fit all in this case.
We talked a lot, and when we talk about limitations, we talk a lot about how active is our active learning compared to what it was before, which was just, literally videos that you watch, you listen to, and then you press a button and you move on to the next one. This one's far more interactive, to coin a cliche. But also we were talking about the assessments as well, and the assessments at the end can also be active in the sense of encouraging someone to think differently about what they've just learned. Is that something? Do you think with our study that's something that we should be pursuing in the future potentially, with regards to both aspects of that, pushing the with procedural, certainly pushing the active nature of it and also the active nature of the assessments.
Yeah, and so there's really two issues there. The first is what constitutes active learning, and a distinction I sometimes like to draw is between active and constructive learning. So the active learning we had was, rather than just sort of watch a video and then get tested on it, you would watch a video and then be required to find some information in it and report that, so that you are acting on the information you see. But you could argue that people are doing that not because they need to or they're getting any value from it, but just because they've been told to. Whereas if they were, for example, given a task to, can you find out who's in the team that you will have to go to if this happens, that becomes constructive learning, where you're constructing something that has a goal for you. And I think that's the one thing that we haven't looked at in this study that sets up a lot of future work, which is goal-directedness. What are you learning it for? How are you going to use this? You want to map your learning onto the way you're going to use that information in the future.
And that has an impact on engagement.
Very much
as
so,
well.
Yeah. To come to the assessment point, I think you're absolutely right that a multiple choice questionnaire is really convenient for assessing online learning. But ultimately, you want to assess people in the way they're going to use the information themselves. So I think the two things are very much linked. Really, what you want to do is you want to put the assessment into the context of, right, you are now performing the task that you will have to do with this information. And then you'll get a much more, a much stronger measure of the effectiveness of the learning that's gone on.
I think that's definitely something we're looking to do as we move forward.
And with changes in technology, it becomes easier to do that, even in an online context, because you can start using simulations, virtual reality, generative AI, that kind of thing, so that people can perform their knowledge back to you in ways that are richer than just multiple choice questions. Yeah,
I think we're certainly with our LearnStream 2 product, which was the one that we used for the procedural learning. That can involve following the steps as required, but also then requesting them to try new things and say, how do you think, if you don't use this way of doing it, can you do it this way? Which again, I suppose, is a sort of constructive.
Yes, it's if you like, it's a problem-based learning approach, where rather than saying, here's a bunch of information, learn it, perform it, you say, here's a bunch of information, use this to carry out a task.
It's not just a matter of remembering it or what's the word I'm looking for? Recognizing it.
It's performing it.
It's more about performing it.
Yeah.
With regards to the overall effectiveness of the learning, how you said that it was 60 to 80% of people successfully passed the tests, or at least got the expected grade. When we're talking about learning styles, which you mentioned earlier, how much did that end up having an impact on the cognitive styles, I suppose? How much did that have an impact on the results?
Not an awful lot, actually. There was no effect of cognitive styles on the procedural learning. It didn't matter whether you were an analytic or a holistic thinker. Learning procedures was not impacted by that. There was some effect of learning styles in the declarative information, particularly in terms of chunk size. The smaller chunk size benefited analytic thinkers more than holistic thinkers. And again, that kind of makes sense. If you're breaking things down into small bits of information, an analytic person is going to find that useful because they'll kind of puzzle solve them together.
Rather than someone who wants
a holistic
to
person, it breaks the pattern for them, so that they have to overcome that.
Right. That makes sense. Although active learning doesn't have as much of an impact on our declarative courses, do you think we haven't talked about sort of moving forward, and we haven't talked about things like spaced retrieval, and we mentioned sort of more active assessments. Do you think that might have an impact? Would then cause the active nature of it to have more of an impact on the learning, or not?
So let's take the first part of that, this notion of spaced retrieval practice. So the basic idea behind that is that rather than learn at one time, whatever the chunk size, is that you learn a bit, then you come back later and you relearn it when you learn some new information alongside. And then you come back after a longer time and relearn it again as you learn more information, so that you feel like you're cascading your learning over a period of time. And that's shown to have real benefits for learning declarative information, because it has this notion, first of all, of rehearsal. So you're not just learning it once, you're learning it a number of times, and you're enriching it by attaching it to other information at different times as well. And it seems to be quite effective. And it seems very likely that that would be a very powerful addition to the learning of declarative information. And I think it remains to be seen whether having an active assessment would demonstrate the benefits of active learning for declarative information. It might do. That's an empirical question. And happy to come back and test it for you.
Like that. I have so many questions, so many things I want to do and try. You mentioned about learning for a reason. A lot of the people that we provide training for are, for example, qualified social workers. It might be refresher training. It might be training about new legislation. What approach is there a different approach that should be taken if you're training an expert compared to training a novice, aside from the content itself?
So, again, I think it depends if you're training declarative or procedural knowledge. With declarative knowledge, I think my top tip, if you like, would be to have a framework where you can indicate this is what we think you already know. And then this is the new knowledge that you've got to fit into that framework. So that what you're doing is you're basically taking this idea, I think I talked about it before, of an advanced organizer, where you've got an overview of a whole subject. And so an expert will have that overview in their head. And what they need to support on is to fit the new information into that framework. So structure is really critical in that context. It remains to be seen whether the chunk size effect we've got with what were effectively novices in our study would be found with experts. There's reasonable doubt as to whether it would be, because, of course, experts will have rehearsed their knowledge a lot and will have organised it in a form where with just a simple few retrieval cues, they can recall vast amounts.
They've already chunked it.
They've organised it into their own chunks, So, again, more work to be done. It's with procedural knowledge, it's, again, the difference between experts and novices is going to be very, very significant indeed. And because experts will have rehearsed their procedures and, in many instances, automated them so that they'll be able to retrieve things without actually consciously being aware of them.
Like a kind of, I know there's the cliche that the brain is a muscle. We know that areas that are used more on a day-to-day basis change in size. Taxi drivers have a very large hippocampus, for example, because it drives direction or something like that. And I know this isn't an area, we talked about this before. You said, if you want to talk about that, you'll need to speak to my colleagues, such and such.
I don't do the wet stuff.
No. But it's kind of like a muscle memory, almost.
Yeah. So, I mean, the classic example is driving a car. Yeah. So when you're an experienced driver, you don't think about which side the indicator's on. You just know. So if you get into a hire car and the indicator's on the other side, you stumble. You probably stumble more than somebody who's relatively new to driving, because they won't expect to know, if you like. So when it comes to procedural learning, when, for example, you're taking a set of procedures that experts have learnt one way and you've got to retrain in another way, you face a very different learning context to a novice who hasn't got legacy knowledge, if you like. And I think at that point, the active learning becomes all the more important, because in a sense you've got to deactivate old procedures and activate new ones. So I think the focus on active learning of procedures becomes even more important. And this idea of deactivating is something we haven't explored empirically, but this idea of how do you forget stuff that is automated is a real challenge.
Because and this is where I'm going to show my ignorance. And I hate the phrase, but subconscious, I suppose, is that where the automated stuff comes
absolutely.
from? And your subconscious can't lie, is something I've heard, possibly from yourself.
Possibly, yeah.
So therefore, as you say, it's literally, it's telling you the truth the whole time, and suddenly you're being shown something that's essentially is betraying that.
Well,
that truth.
Yes, if your world changes, if suddenly the door pushes rather than pulls.
Well, no one likes change,
and nobody likes change with a good reason, because of course all the procedures you've learnt and rehearsed and automated so that you don't have to think about them, suddenly you have to think about them, and it slows you down and you make mistakes, etc. So the other thing to be aware of, I suppose, in retraining is you must be very tolerant of, indeed encourage, mistakes. You want to let people see what happens when they use the old procedures, and reward them for making mistakes, because they need to see the distinctions that happen when they use a new set of procedures. And I think that's almost heretical to say you should encourage failure. But I think particularly when you've got learning of new procedures to replace old ones, actually exposing those failures is quite an important part of effective learning.
We do a little bit like that in declarative as well, where we provide 3 options on a topic that needs to be not learnt in a serious way, but for example, how many people live in the borough of Buckinghamshire? No one knows that. People who have taken the course, whatever it might be, welcome to Buckinghamshire, would not know that. But by getting it wrong, that might sort of embed it in their brain, possibly, because no one likes making mistakes, I guess.
And one way, of course, you can overcome that is to show people the mistakes of others and get them to correct them as learning.
And people get vicarious pleasure out of that.
It's called smug learning.
Love smug learning. So, final question, I suppose, and just to throw this out there. In your mind, what are the most sort of exciting new learning theories that are out there? Ones that you've come up with, and also others that you might have heard about on the grapevine?
I guess the most exciting things are happening at a neural level. We're beginning to understand much better about how memories are stored in the brain. As I've mentioned, I don't really do the wet stuff of the brain. I focus on the mind rather than the brain, if you like. But I think there's a lot of exciting things happening in terms of understanding the complexities of how we store information in the brain. Latest theories of memory have shifted away from this idea of there being kind of stores, massively interconnected stores, to an idea that our knowledge is much more clustered than we might expect. There's a theory called temporal clustering, which is this idea that we tend to remember episodes around a particular time frame. And if you want to optimize retrieval, you optimize retrieval around that time frame. If you disrupt that time frame by saying, tell me everything that happened from the beginning or whatever, you can actually impair memory a lot. So I think there's in terms of learning technologies, there's some interesting work to be done around getting people to associate the learning they've done with the time at which they've done it and the context in which they're doing it.
Well, we've talked before this about situational learning, and you mentioned the story of the divers who sent down to learn some information at the bottom of the sea, brought up, and then some were sent down to answer quiz or answer assessment about that, and some did it in a classroom. And the divers at the bottom of the sea did remarkably better because that's the context in which they learnt it.
Yeah, that's right. So that's a study by Godden and Budley, and it takes us way back into the early 1970s when we could afford to hire divers to do our research. And of course, incidentally, the flip side works as well. If you learn the material above sea and then have to record
have to do it down in
you're much worse. So this is context-dependent retrieval, as it's known.
Right.
Basically, the context in which you learn material is the best context in which to retrieve it. So, for example, if you're cramming for an exam, then actually putting yourself into exam conditions to learn has a small but noticeable benefit Whereas if you sit in bed at midnight cramming the stuff in, to sit in the classroom at 9 o'clock the next day, it's going to be less effective. So this context specificity is important.
Why they do mock exams, for example, in the halls that they're going to be.
So in terms of a company like Me Learning, the technologies that are becoming available allow you to construct the context of performance a lot better. So that I feel the future of online learning is likely to be a move away from, if you like, textbook presentation or even video presentation to immersive presentation, where you're immersing somebody in the world in which they're going to work. And you're teaching them in that world so that when they're retrieving in the real world, it's the right context.
Downsides to that are obviously budget, because we've got enough. I think we've got enough for one snorkel if we want people to do the underwater thing. One snorkel. We haven't got the underwater team. But again, that we're talking sort of virtual reality. We're talking 3D environments, for example.
Sure. Watch this space, though, because I think, yes, 5 years ago, VR was prohibitive. Is it now? I'm not sure. I'm not sure it is so prohibitively expensive. And I think even small moves towards contextualizing people's learning is a helpful thing to do. Even if it's just learn on the go so that you're in your workplace, rather than taking an hour to do something, you actually say, okay, I'm just going to log in now and say, I'm in this context. What do I need to learn for this moment on your mobile phone?
Mobile technology has obviously benefited a lot of people.
Sure. And if the chunk size thing is playing out, you can be saying, okay, I've got 5 minutes before the meeting starts. What can I learn about this kind of meeting?
Brilliant. Tom, thank you ever so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Fascinating, as always. I could sit here all day. And thank you very much for watching. And yeah, keep learning.
Thank you.
Keep learning.
Yeah, that was a bit rogue.
New tagline.